After your latest adventure, you take your companions back to your old stomping grounds, to the Laughing Granny Tavern. You haven't been here in a very long while, and as you set foot inside, you are hit with the familiar smells of pipeweed, homebrewed fresh ale, and Perpetual stew. A sense of comfort washes over you as you realize that although both the world outside and you have changed, things inside have stayed the same. As you take a seat around a low wooden table on creaky benches, you hear Granny laugh out loud at a joke a patron told. She rushes over with a few tankards filled with fresh ale, and as she recognizes you, she starts laughing. She's happy to see you. She says in her familiar voice, "The stew is hot as always. I have some old hard cheeses, some smoked hams, and some salted eggs. I'm gonna bring a bit of everything." And then she continues by asking you, how have you been? How's life outside? You tell her a few stories, as you know that's one of the best currencies in her establishment. You don't tell her of any bad things, you only tell her a few funny, silly stories, and she's delighted. As you finish your stories, she gives you a toothy grin, and then she rushes towards the kitchen entrance and relays your order to the cook. She then begins making her rounds once again, refilling tankards. In the corner of the tavern, a half-elf with sun-kissed skin begins softly plucking his lute. It's gonna be a night to remember for sure. A few minutes pass by before a tavern wench comes over with a tray filled with platters of cheeses and meats and eggs and pickles, and earthenware bowls filled to the brim with Perpetual stew, or with what Granny calls her undying stew. Welcome to the Laughing Granny Tavern. Hello everyone and welcome to Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history and world building. In today's episode we will be talking about taverns and alehouses in medieval times, their similarities, their differences, and what sets them apart from inns. Before we begin our discussion, let us talk about the miniature. This is Molly, the Likoi rogue from Animal Adventures Tales of Cats and Catacombs. By the way, Likoi is the English pronunciation of the Greek word liki, which means wolves. As you can see, this is how the Likoi cat looks in reality, a little like a werewolf. And with that, let us begin. Before we begin our discussion on taverns and alehouses, we must set them apart from inns. Inns were places where people sought out sleeping accommodations. Some inns also provided some food and drinks for their paying customers, but not all of them. In comparison to taverns and alehouses, which provided food and drink, but did not or rarely provided sleeping accommodations. With that out of the way, let us talk about taverns and alehouses, their similarities and differences. Alehouses provided drink and food for their low and middle class customers. Most alehouses would serve, as the name suggests, ales and ciders. Of course, some of them had wines and meads, but mostly they served ales and ciders. When it comes to food, they provided simple food, such as cheeses, meats, eggs, bread, and stews. Most brewing in medieval times was done by women. Not universally, but mostly. If you're wondering why, the answer is quite simple. Brewing was cheap and easy to do. All you needed was a large enough cauldron and something to stir with. There were no fixed recipes for brewing. You could use any kind of grains, and they did. They used oats, barley, anything that was on hand and in surplus. Any regulations regarding ale brewing were set by the local lord, and the only quality testing was done by tasting the actual result. If the ale was too weak or the quality was too poor, fines and penalties could be applied. But depending on the individual who was the subject of this fine, they might have been waived. Taverns. When it comes to these establishments, they attract a higher class clientele. They usually served wines as opposed to ales, wines and meads. If the proprietor of such an establishment didn't have a vineyard of their own, they would be closely collaborating with somebody who did. Taverns were places where people drank meads, so honey wine, and wines. By the way, ale and wines were also brewed in monasteries. In medieval times, monasteries were actually industrial centers, especially when it came to drinks. These are the similarities and the differences between a tavern and an alehouse. When it comes to alehouses, the best example you should have in the back of your mind is the prancing pony from The Lord of the Rings. That is the classic alehouse. Of course, that establishment also offered accommodations, but that is, as I mentioned before, a rare. The front house was an alehouse. That was the basic function of it. When it comes to taverns, I don't really know what examples to give you, as in most fantasy works, the two are interchangeable, the two overlap. You have on one hand the prancing pony, on the other, I imagine something Elrond would have in Rivendell. A fancy place where people would go, drink wine and have good food. And with that, let's take a peek at the miniature. After finishing with the fur and applying a black base to Molly's armor using Abaddon Black, I am starting from Caliban Green and aiming for Cabalite Green highlights as I am painting the gambeson and the hood Molly is wearing. Once I am happy with the result, I am mixing Mournfang Brown and Catchen Flesh and starting on the leather pieces of the equipment, all the little bits of armor, leg armor and tail armor, and all the belts. Let us now talk about the entertainment one might expect to find when visiting a medieval tavern or alehouse. In fantasy worlds, and I am guilty of this as well, all taverns and alehouses have some sort of entertainment arranged for their patrons. I'm not saying that that's wrong, your world, your rules, but in reality that wouldn't have been the case. Don't get me wrong, entertainment, you could find plenty of it, but not in an official capacity. Imagine village festivities, village celebrations. You would always find somebody who knows how to play an instrument or two. You would also find people with nice singing voices, or you would be able to hear songs that don't require a nice singing voice. People love having fun, and after a few drinks, all inhibitions go out the window, and people start singing and dancing. You might expect to find something like this in medieval alehouses, especially in rural areas. Of course, in rural areas, you won't generally find alehouses and taverns, not the officially established places, as people would drink with their neighbors who just finished brewing a fresh batch of ale or just finished winemaking. But in larger settlements where you would have taverns or alehouses, you might find a traveling circus, or you might find troubadours, a jester, you might find skalds, bards. But very, very wealthy establishments were able to employ individuals solely for the purpose of entertaining their patrons, and usually this happened when a tavern was serving very influential, very wealthy, very powerful people. Most shows were reserved for feasts and banquets. During feasts and banquets, you might expect to find skalds, bards, troubadours, jesters, fire eaters, dancers, exotic dancers, anything. But usually people would have to resort to drinking and singing, and that's the full extent of it. Another form of entertainment that one might expect in taverns and alehouses was prostitution. The staff would provide physical services, for the right price of course, but not in all establishments, and especially not in villages or small communities where people would find out of these kind of practices, and they were very frowned upon because people, because religion, because it's prostitution. Before we move on, let's take another peek at the miniature. As you can see, the miniature is not too shabby. I am combining Kebalite green and Catachan flash to make a dirtier green. I'm watering it down quite a bit to make a wash. I'm applying it to Molly's backpack and pouches. Earlier I've applied Rakarth flesh to them, and now I want to deepen the details. I want to bring more depth to these parts of the miniature and trying to bring them all together using a dirtier shade of green. Using a little Abaddon black, I am adding the finishing touches to the leather braces and greaves and vambraces and the tail armor. A little tedious, but I assure you quite enjoyable for me, as I'm usually listening to music or some favorite show while I'm doing this. To be honest, for the longest of times I've had problems with naming places. I'm not talking about people, that's another can of worms, but I struggled with naming especially taverns, inns and alehouses. But I think I cracked the secret behind it, so I'm gonna share it with you. Naming taverns and alehouses is quite easy. You have to remember that for the longest of times, most people were illiterate. They didn't know how to read and didn't know how to write. When naming a place, you have to think of the people who cannot read the name of your establishment. How do you go about that? Simple. You use something very common, something that will stick with them and easy to remember. Things like animals, objects, colors, places, names, an adjective, strong, small, prancing, the function of the place, the inn on the corner, the old alehouse. It's as simple as that. Now let me give you some examples. Harry Potter, the Leaky Cauldron. Lord of the Rings, the Prancing Pony. My World, the Laughing Granny. The Real World, the Red Lion, the Mighty Oak, the Three Drunkards, the Green Gate, the Swan, the Inn, so on and so forth. There were times when people used to advertise their establishments by using a very common household item. They would put on the wall beside the door or above it such an item. A boot, a broom, a cauldron, such as in the Leaky Cauldron, a hat, etc. It is very important to make sure that your establishment is easy to remember and easy to differentiate from another establishment, your competition. Not everybody had a painted sign above the entrance, not everybody had writing above the entrance, but everybody had a very easy to remember name. And with that, we are approaching the end of our discussion, and because of that, I'm gonna ask you to join me in seeing how the miniature is coming along. With most of the details finished, I am trying to identify areas that I still need to work on. And as it happens, I believe that the tip of the tail is a little bit too bright, so I'm using Nuln Oil to darken it a little bit. Now, using Agrax Earthshade, I am adding more depth to the pouches attached to her armor and the bedroll on her back. Now, using Stormhost Silver, I am dotting any buckles, any metal bits on her equipment. Before we wrap things up, I want to give you a few bonus information regarding what you've heard me talk about during this episode, such as tableware and the stews. Tableware. Most of the tableware in medieval times was made out of wood. Some establishments, usually the very wealthy, also had pewter tableware. Most was made out of wood. It was easily replaceable and it wasn't expensive to make. We're gonna be talking about other utensils and table manners on a different episode. Now let's tackle the stew. Perpetual stew, never-ending stew, immortal stew, endless stew, however you want to call it, or if you want to go by the official name, hunter's stew or hunter's pot, is a very widespread and very old concept. The basic principle behind it is quite interesting. You would have a huge pot of stew that is kept over a fire at all times, making sure that it is above 60 degrees Celsius or 140 Fahrenheit, so above the dangerous temperature where things start to grow inside and evolve. You don't want that. And while you were serving out of the cauldron, you would replenish it with water and fresh ingredients. Let them stew for a bit, let the aromas and ingredients mingle for a bit, and then you would continue serving. You want to stay away from potent ingredients such as garlic or cabbage, as they tend to flavor the stew for months to come. And you want to stay away from things that change the color. You wouldn't want to add beets, as it would turn everything red within the cauldron. And when I say that the taste or the color would be changed for months to come, I literally mean for months to come. You would do this for months, even years. The longest sustained stew, if I can use that phrase, in the recent history was 49 years. The same stew was served for 49 years. I don't know if it's the same stew, if you add fresh ingredients over and over again, is it the same stew you started with? Philosophical question. But you would keep adding ingredients as you consume it and make sure it's always replenished. The only moment where in certain places of the world the full content of a cauldron would be replaced with new ingredients would be in the Christian world before Lent, as people weren't allowed to eat meat. Otherwise, you would simply add more and more ingredients and simply keep it simmering, keep it boiling, and make sure that everything is cooked and you never run out. And with that, thank you so much for the privilege of your time, and I truly hope that you found some inspiration, especially when it comes to naming establishments, or at least found out something new. Please like, subscribe, share, hit the bell, leave a comment, and I will see you all here next time on Funky Monkey MP. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers.